movement and established the gospel. They built churches and really influenced the entire culture for the Lord. But President Harding declared, "Never in the history of the world has there been a finer example of civilization following Christianity. The missionaries led under the banner of the cross, and the settlers moved close behind under the star-spangled symbol of the nation. Among all the records of evangelizing effort as the forerunner of human advancement, there is none so impressive as this early Oregon mission and its marvelous consequences. To the men and women of that early day whose first thought was to carry the gospel to the Indians, and who found that in serving God they were also serving their country and their fellow men, to them we pay tribute today. To them we owe a debt of gratitude which we can never repay, save partially through recognitions such as you have accorded today." The lesson cannot fail to impress itself. In this test of self-reliant citizenship, there came the rugged, militant, wholesome West. Greater things were wrought. Larger accomplishments were recorded. Greater victory was won in this wholesome, inspiring individualism that will ever attend paternalism or the government assumption of the tasks, which are the natural inheritance of the builders who may better serve for themselves. Government may well provide opportunity, but the worthwhile accomplishment is the privilege and duty of man. I thank you from my heart for permitting me to participate in doing homage to these brave souls. I rejoice particularly in the opportunity afforded me of voicing my appreciation who honestly tries to be a Christian soldier. And then he went on to name a man and honor a man who blazed the trail, named Hezekiah Johnson. Hezekiah Johnson was a man who was born in Maryland in March 6, 1799, and he was born into a Baptist preacher's family. The family moved to Ohio in about 1816. There, Hezekiah was saved about 1825. He was soon licensed to preach. Later, he married Miss Eliza Harris, and whom he was married to for over 40 years. In April of 1827, he was ordained to the gospel ministry, and he preached in various places in Ohio until he knew the Lord was calling him to be a missionary to Iowa. And so he began going into Iowa, which would have been pretty far west at that point, and he began preaching specifically to the Indians. That was where his heart was, to preach to the Indians. And then he really was the first Baptist missionary into Iowa, actually, and he began to build churches there. In 1845, the call had come a couple of years earlier that there was this great opportunity in the Pacific Northwest. And this is something that I don't think is really, I feel, is not taught certainly not in our public schools anymore, but what happened as the call came and the men and women of America began to move westward on the Oregon Trail. Just an amazing story. And what is totally lost in most of what is taught us, and certainly in the world, is that the missionaries led the way, many of them Baptist missionaries. Of course, their first priority at first was to reach and win the Indians, to establish Indian churches. But as those men and women followed those missionaries west, it's really an amazing story, one we won't tell this morning. But so Hezekiah Johnson and his family, and a man named Ezra Fisher, who has his own story to tell, their families, they began the journey to the Oregon Territory in 1845. The hardships can't even be described. I don't think we can even appreciate. Can you imagine going through wilderness from Iowa to the Pacific? Imagine that, walking and riding horseback. There were no roads. The Oregon Trail is a little bit of a misnomer. The trail was cut as they went. And just imagine the hardships. And he suffered greatly. His family suffered greatly as they moved west. There was camp fever. There was all kinds of disease and death. They reached Oregon City in December of 1845. And as I said, can you imagine the difficulties of crossing the mountains in the west there? It got to the point where there were no wagons that could cross the mountains. The only way that these people could get to where they were going was by pack horse, by mule, or on foot, and they would cross these mountains. They arrived in December of 1845. That's the winter. Imagine traveling in the winter through those areas, and the allurement of the liberal land grants that the government promised people that would be there is what many of the settlers gave them the excitement to move further west, and they did. And in 1842 and 1843, of course, the immigration started and continued almost until 1850. It was among these pioneers that Johnson and Fisher, they ministered, they planted churches all over that area, because many people didn't make it to the Northwest. They would stop along the way and say, that's far enough. We can't endure this any longer. And so they would stop in what would become Nebraska and Wyoming and Montana and these areas. And so they were building churches as they went, knowing that families would be raised up and communities would eventually be raised up. When they arrived in the Pacific, Oregon was almost an unbroken wilderness. Towns existed mostly on paper. The men, these two men, they traveled by Indian canoe, they traveled by Indian pony to the various churches that they began, and literally sometimes built literally by hand, the church buildings. Johnson traveled as a missionary evangelist and sometimes served as pastor. He would do what we know, he would pastor several churches at the same time, traveling each Sunday to a different church over 2 or 3 months, preaching in those churches. Very difficult way to build a church, but this is all there was. This is all they could do. And his travels were quite extensive and laborious. Many times he was on foot. It said that he said that his best study and his happiest moments were on horseback. He got a lot of Bible study done traveling on horseback. And it's probably those journeys that contributed to his failing health. He had violent attacks of headaches, probably migraines, and severe lung infections. In fact, his health began to fail in 1856, and he died on August 28th of 1866 of typhoid pneumonia. He had a thorough knowledge of Scripture. Because of his large family and, of course, these extensive travels, he did not have degrees behind his name. He couldn't get a lot of schooling after he left. He did have schooling before he left the East, but he was not able to finish that schooling as he went west. He did publish some works, but when he died, the Willamette Association, which is a Baptist missionary association in the West, passed the following resolution. They said this: resolved that in the removal of our great beloved elder Hezekiah Johnson, as Christians we have lost a brother, faithful and true, the Bible an expounder, earnest and able, the pulpit a preacher, forcible and instructive, truth a defender, bold and untiring, and the church, and his church, is a laborer who in seeking its welfare conferred not with flesh and blood, but toiled amidst discouragement and hardships, never doubting her ultimate and glorious triumph. And it's hard to tell a story like this because you can't even imagine really what the hardships that men like this went through, and there are many more that we aren't naming this morning. But I want to thank the Lord, and President Harding specifically pointed out Hezekiah Johnson in his speech when he was honoring those that traveled the Oregon Trail on that anniversary. And I want to thank the Lord this morning for these men and women, mostly forgotten, that what they did following the Lord to the West Coast is really an amazing story, and the one that we will never know. We may know the details when we get to heaven, but really an amazing story.